A compassionate leave. Nothing ever seemed to go right for the 57th Division. It had come overseas just in time to take heavy casualties in the Battle of the Bulge. Then, too quickly strengthened with masses of new replacements, it had plodded through further combat in eastern France and in Germany, never doing badly but never doing especially well until the war was over in May. And by July of that year, when service with the Army of Occupation had begun to give every promise of turning into the best time of their lives, there were an extraordinary number of unattached girls in Germany then. All the men of the luckless 57th were loaded into freight trains and hauled back to France. Many of them wondered if this was their punishment for having been indifferent soldiers. Some of them even voiced that question during the tedious ride in the boxcars until others told them to shut up about it. And there was little hope of welcome or comfort in their destination. The people of France were famous at the time for detesting Americans. When the train carrying one battalion came to a stop at last in a sunny field of weeds near Roms, which nobody even wanted to learn how to pronounce, the men dropped off and struggled with their equipment into trucks that drove them to their new place of residence, an encampment of olive drab squad tents hastily pitched a few days before, where they were told to stuff muslin mattress covers with the clumps of straw provided for that purpose, and to cradle their empty rifles upside down in the crotches formed by the crossed wooden legs of their canvas cots. Captain Henry R. Widows, a gruff and hard-drinking man who commanded C Company, explained everything the next morning, when he addressed his assembled men in the tall yellow grass of the company street. "Way I understand it," he began, taking the nervous little backward and forward steps that were characteristic of him. "This here is what they call a redeployment camp. They got a good many of 'em going up all through this area. They'll be moving men out of Germany according to the point system and bringing 'em through these camps for processing on their way home. And what we're gonna do the what do you call it, the processing. We're the permanent party here. I don't know what our duties will be, mostly supply work and clerical work, I imagine. Soon as I have more information, I'll let you know, okay?" Captain Widows had been awarded the Silver Star for leading an attack through knee-deep snow last winter. The attack had gained him an excellent tactical advantage and lost him nearly half a platoon. Even now, many of the men in the company were afraid of him. A few weeks after their arrival in the camp, when their straw mattresses had flattened out and their rifles were beginning to speckle with rust from the dew, there was a funny incident in one of the squad tents. A buck sergeant named Myron Phelps, who was 33 but looked much older, and who had been a soft coal miner in civilian life, delicately tapped the ash from a big PX cigar and said, "Ah, I wish you kids quit talking about Germany. I'm tired of all this Germany, Germany, Germany." Then he stretched out on his back, causing his flimsy cot to wobble on the uneven earth. He folded one arm under his head to suggest a world of peace, using the other to gesture lazily with the cigar. "I mean, what the hell would you be doing if you was in Germany, huh? Well, you'd be out getting laid and getting the clap and getting the syphilis and getting the blue balls, that's all. And you'd be drinking up all the schnapps and beer and getting soft and getting out of shape. Right? Right? Well, if you ask me, this here is a whole lot better. We got fresh air, we got shelter, we got food, we got discipline. This is a man's life." And at first everybody thought he was kidding. It seemed to take at least 5 seconds while they gaped at Phelps, and then at each other, and then at Phelps again, before the first thunderclap of laughter broke. "Jesus Christ, Phelps, a man's life," somebody cried, and somebody else called, "Phelps, you're an asshole. You've always been an asshole." Phelps had struggled upright under the attack. His eyes and mouth were pitiably angry, and there were pink blotches of embarrassment in both cheeks. How about you? How about your fucking coal mine, Phelps? Was that a man's life too?" He looked helpless, trying to speak and not be heard, and soon he began to look wretched. It was clear in his face that he knew the phrase "a man's life" would now be passed around to the other tents, to other explosions of laughter, and that it would haunt him as long as he stayed in this company. Private First Class Paul Colby was still laughing along with the others when he left the tent that afternoon on his way to an appointment with Captain Widdows, but he wasn't sorry when the laughter dwindled and died behind him. Poor old Myron Phelps had made Buck sergeant because he'd been one of the only two men left in his squad after the bulge, and he would almost certainly lose the stripes soon if he went on making a fool of himself. And there was more to it than that. Whether Paul Colby was quite able to admit to himself or not, he had agreed with at least one element in Phelps's outburst. He too had come to like the simplicity, the order and the idleness of life in these tents in the grass. There was nothing to prove here. Colby had been one of the many replacements who joined the company in Belgium last January, and the few remaining months of the war had taken him through pride and terror and fatigue and dismay. He was 19 years old. At Captain Widow's desk in the orderly room tent, Colby came to attention, saluted, and said, "Sir, I want to request permission to apply for a compassionate leave." "For a what?" "For a compassionate Eddies." "Thank you, sir." The thing is, back in the States, you could sometimes get a compassionate leave if you had trouble at home, if there had been a death, or if somebody was very sick or something like that. And now over here, since the war ended, they've been giving them out for guys just to visit close relatives in Europe. I mean, nobody has to be sick or anything. "Oh yeah?" Widow said. "Yeah, I think I read that. You got relatives here?" "Yes, sir. My mother and my sister in England." "You English?" "No, sir. I'm from Michigan. That's where my father lives." "Well, then, I don't get it. How come They're divorced, sir." "Oh." And Widow's frown made clear that he still didn't quite get it, but he began writing on a pad. "Okay, Colby," he said at last. "Now, you write down your mother's name here and her address, and I'll get somebody to put the rest of the shit together. You'll be informed if it comes through, but I better tell you, all the paperwork's so fucked up throughout this area, I don't think you better count on it." So Colby decided not to count on it, which brought a slight easing of pressure in his conscience. He hadn't seen his mother or sister since he was 11 and knew almost nothing of them now. He had applied for the leave mostly from a sense of duty and because there had seemed no alternative. But now there were two possibilities, each mercifully beyond his control. If it came through, there might be 10 days of excessive politeness and artificial laughter and awkward silences, while they all tried to pretend he wasn't a stranger. There might be slow sightseeing tours of London in order to kill whole afternoons. They might want to show him typically English things to do, like nibbling fish and chips out of a twisted newspaper, or whatever the hell else it was that typically English people did. And there would be repeated expressions of how nice everything was while they all counted the days until it was over. If it didn't come through, he might never see them again. But then he had resigned himself to that many years ago when it had mattered a great deal more, when it had, in fact, amounted to an almost unendurable loss. "Well, your mother was one of these bright young English girls who come over to America thinking the streets are paved with gold," Paul Colby's father had explained to him, more than a few times, usually walking around the living room with a drink in his hand. "So we got married, and you and your sister came along, and then pretty soon I guess she started wondering, well, where's the great promise of this country? Where's all the happiness? Where's the gold? You follow me, Paul?" "Sure." "So she started getting restless. Damn, she got restless. But I'll spare you that part of it. And pretty soon she wanted a divorce." "Well, okay," I thought, "that's in the cards, but then, by Jesus," she said, "I'll take the children." And I told her, I said, "Wait a minute." I said, "Hold your horses a minute here, Miss Queen of England. Let's play fair." Well, fortunately, I had this great friend of mine at the time, Earl Gibbs, and Earl was a crackerjack lawyer. He told me, "Fred, she wouldn't have a leg to stand on in a custody dispute." I said, "Earl, just get me the kids." I said, "Let me have the kids, Earl, that's all I ask." And he tried. Earl did his best for me, but you see, by then she'd moved down to Detroit, and she had both of you there with her, so it wasn't easy. I went down there once to take you both to a ball game, but your sister said she didn't like baseball and wasn't feeling very well anyway. Christ, what grief a little thing like that can cause. So it was just you and me went out to Briggs Stadium that day and watched the Tigers play. Do you remember that? Do you remember that, Paul? Sure. And then afterwards, I brought you back up here to stay with me. Well, your mother threw a fit. That's the only word for it. She was wholly irrational. She already had boat tickets to England, you see, for the three of you, and she came storming up here in this rattletrap little Plymouth that she didn't even know how to drive. And she started yelling and screaming that I'd kidnapped you. Do you remember? Yes. Well, that was one god awful afternoon. Earl Gibbs and his wife happened to be here with me at the time, and that saved the day. Or half saved it, I guess. Because once we'd all managed to get your mother calmed down a little, Earl went to her and talked to her for a long time, and in the end he said, Vivian, count your blessings. Settle for what you can get. So you see, she had no choice. She drove away in that crummy car with your sister riding beside her, and I guess a couple weeks later they were in London. And that was it. That was it. Well, but the point I'm trying to make here, Paul, is that things did work out pretty much for the best after all. I was fortunate enough to meet your stepmother, and we're right for each other. Anybody can see we're right for each other, right? As for your mother, I know she was never happy with me. Any man, Paul, any man, ought to know when a woman isn't happy with him. And what the hell? Life's too short. I forgave her long ago for the pain she caused me as my wife. There's only one thing I can't forgive her for, ever. She took away my little girl. Paul Colby's sister Marcia was almost exactly a year younger than he. At 5, she had taught him how to blow steady bubbles in bathwater. At 8, she had kicked over his electric train in order to persuade him that paper dolls could be more entertaining, which was true. A year or so after that, trembling in fear together, they had dared each other to jump from the high limb of a maple tree, and they'd done it, though he would always remember that she went first. On the afternoon of their parents' hysteria, of the lawyer's sonorous entreaties for order in the living room, he had watched Marcia from the house as she waited in the passenger seat of the mud-splattered Plymouth in the driveway. And because he was fairly sure nobody would notice his absence, he went out to visit with her. When she saw him coming, she rolled down her window and said, "What are they doing in there anyway?" "Well, I don't know. There's a lot of, I don't really know what they're doing. I guess it'll be okay, though." "Yeah, well, I guess so, too. Only you better get back inside, Paul, okay? I mean, I don't think Daddy'd want to see you out here." "Okay." On his way to the house, he stopped and looked back, and they exchanged quick, shy waves. At first, there were frequent letters from England, jolly, sometimes silly, hastily written ones from Marcia, careful and increasingly stilted ones from his mother. During the Blitz of 1940, when every American radio news commentator implied that all London was in rubble and on fire, Marcia wrote at some length to suggest that perhaps the reports might be exaggerated. Things were certainly terrible in the East End, she said, which was cruel, because that was where most of the poor people lived, but there were very extensive areas of the city that hadn't been touched. And the suburb where she and their mother were, 8 miles out, had been perfectly safe. She was 13 when she wrote that, and it stayed in his mind as a remarkably intelligent, remarkably thoughtful letter for someone of that age. Over the next few years, she drifted out of the habit of writing except for Christmas and birthday cards. But his mother's letters continued with dogged regularity, whether he'd answered the last one or not, and it became an effort of will to read them, an effort even to open the flimsy blue envelopes and unfold the notepaper. Her strain in the writing was so clear that it could only make for strain in the reading. Her final, pointedly cheerful paragraph always came as a relief, and he could sense her own relief at having brought it off. She had married again within a year or two after going back to England. She and her new husband soon had a son, your little half-brother, of whom she said Marcia was enormously fond. In 1943, she wrote that Marcia was with the American Embassy in London now, which seemed a funny thing to say about a 16-year-old girl, and there were no supporting details. He had written to his sister from Germany once, managing to work in a few deft references to his combat infantry service, and had received no reply. It could have been because military mail was unreliable at the time, but it could also have meant she'd simply neglected to write back, and that had left a small, still open wound in his feelings. Now, after leaving the orderly room, he wrote a quick letter to his mother explaining his helplessness in the matter of the leave. When it was done and mailed, he felt he could easily afford to stretch out on his cot in the drowsing, mildewed, half-deserted tent. He wasn't far across the aisle of the trampled dirt from where poor old Myron Phelps lay sleeping off his shame, or more likely still ashamed and so pretending to sleep. The big news of the following month was that 3-day passes to Paris would now be issued in C Company, a few at a time, and the tents began to ring with shrill and lubricious talk. Sure, the French hated Americans, everybody knew that, but everybody knew what Paris meant, too. All you had to do in Paris, it was said, was walk up to a girl on the street, well-dressed, high-class looking, any kind of girl, and say, "Are you in business, baby?" If she wasn't, she'd smile and say no. If she was, or maybe even if she wasn't, but just sort of happened to feel like that, then, oh, Jesus, God. Paul Colby arranged to take his pass with George Mueller, a quiet and thoughtful boy who had become his best friend in the rifle squad. Several nights before they went to Paris, in one of the soft-voiced conversations that were characteristic of their friendship, he haltingly confided to George Mueller that what he'd never told anyone else, and didn't even want to think about. He had never gotten laid in his life. And Mueller didn't laugh. He'd been a virgin, too, until one night in a bunker with a German girl a week before the war ended. And he wasn't even sure if that counted. The girl had kept laughing and laughing. He didn't know what the hell she was laughing about. And he'd been so nervous that he didn't really get inside her before he came, and then she'd pushed him away. Colby assured him that it did count. It certainly counted a great deal more than any of his own dumb fumblings. And he might have told Mueller about a few of those, but decided they were better kept to himself. Not long before they'd left Germany, C Company had been placed in charge of 200 Russian displaced persons, civilian captives whom the Germans had put to work as unpaid laborers in a small-town plastics factory. On Captain Widows's orders, the newly freed Russians were soon quartered in what looked like the best residential section of town, neat, attractive houses on a hill well away from the factory. And the Germans who had lived up there, those at least who hadn't fled the advancing army days or weeks before, were assigned to the barracks in the old slave laborers' compound. There wasn't much for the riflemen to do in that pleasant, partially bombed-out town but stroll in the gentle spring weather and make occasional gestures at keeping things, as Widows said, under control. Paul Colby was on guard duty, alone at the very top of the residential hill one afternoon at sunset, when a Russian girl came out and smiled at him, as though she'd been watching him from a window. She was 17 or so, slim and pretty, wearing that kind of cheap old ruined cotton dress that all the Russian women wore, and her breasts looked as firm and tender as ripe nippled peaches. Apart from knowing what he would absolutely have to get his hands on her, he didn't know what to do. Far down the hill and on either side there was no one else in sight. He made what he hoped was a courtly little bow and shook hands with her. That seemed an appropriate opening for an acquaintance that would have to take place without language, and she gave no sign of thinking it silly or puzzling. Then he bent to put his rifle and helmet on the grass, straightened up again, and took her in his arms. She felt marvelous, and kissed her mouth, and there was a thrilling amount of tongue in the way she kissed back. Soon he had one splendid breast naked in his hand. He fondled it as impersonally as if it were a nippled peach, and blood was flowing heavily in it. But then the old inevitable shyness and the terrible awkwardness set in, as they'd set in with every girl he had ever touched. And as always before, he was quick to find excuses. He couldn't take her back into the house because it would be crowded with other Russians, or so he imagined, and he couldn't have her out here because someone would be sure to come along. It was almost time for the guard truck to pick him up anyway. There seemed nothing to do then but release the girl from their clasping embrace and stand close beside her, one arm still around her, so they could gaze together down the long hill at the sunset. It occurred to him, as they lingered and lingered in that position, that they might make an excellent scene for the final fade-out of some thunderous Soviet-American movie called Victory over the Nazis. When the guard truck did come for him, he couldn't even lie to himself that he felt anger and frustration. He was relieved. There was a taciturn, illiterate rifleman in the second squad named Jesse O. Meeks, one of the 4 or 5 men in the platoon who had to mark X instead of signing the payroll every month. And within 2 days after the fade-out of the great Soviet-American movie, Jesse O. Meeks took full possession of that sweet girl. "Ain't no use looking around for old Meeks tonight," somebody said in the platoon quarters. "No use looking for him tomorrow either, or the day after that. Old Meeks got himself shacked up real fine." But here in France, on a morning bright with promise, Colby and George Mueller presented themselves at the first sergeant's desk to claim their 3-day passes. At the left-hand edge of the desk, on a metal base screwed into the wood, stood an ample rotary dispenser of linked, foil-wrapped condoms. You could reel off as many as you thought you might need. Colby let Mueller go first, in order to watch how many he took, 6. Then he self-consciously took 6 himself and stuffed them into his pocket, and they set out together for the motor pool. They wore their brand-new Eisenhower jackets, with their modest display of ribbons and the handsome blue and silver panels of their combat infantry badges, and they had carefully darkened and shined their combat boots. They walked clumsily, though, because each of them carried 2 cartons of stolen PX cigarettes inside his trouser legs. Cigarettes were said to bring $20 a carton on the Paris black market. Coming into the city was spectacular. The Eiffel Tower, the Arc de Triomphe, there it all was, just the way it looked in Life magazine. And it went on for miles, directions. There was so much of it that you couldn't stop turning and looking again. The truck let them off at the American Red Cross Club, which would serve as a homely base of operations. It provided dormitories and showers and regular meals, and there were rooms for ping pong and for drowsing in deep upholstered chairs. Only some kind of twerp would want to spend much time in this place. But when there was such a wealth of mystery and challenge beyond its doors, but Colby and Mueller agreed to have lunch here anyway, because it was lunchtime. And the next thing they decided was to get rid of the cigarettes. It was easy. A few blocks away, they met a small, tight-faced boy of about 14 who led them upstairs to a triple-locked room that was packed to the ceiling with American cigarettes. He was so intimidating in his silence and so impatient to conclude the deal, paying them all from a huge roll of lovely French banknotes, as to suggest that in 3 or 4 more years he might be an important figure in the European underworld. George Mueller had brought his camera and wanted snapshots to send to his parents, so they took a guided bus tour of major landmarks that went on until late in the afternoon. We ought to have a nap," Mueller said when they were rid of the boring, chattering tour guide at last. "Let's get a nap." There were shabby old men everywhere, selling maps to soldiers, as if selling toy balloons to children. When Colby and Mueller opened the many folds of theirs and spread it flat against the side of an office building, jabbing their forefingers at different parts of it and both talking at once, it was their first discord of the day. Colby knew, from having read The Sun Also Rises in high school, that the left bank was where everything nice was most likely to happen. Mueller had read that book too, but he'd been listening to the guys in the tent for weeks, and so he favored the area up around the Place Pigalle. "Well, but it's all prostitutes up there, George," Colby said. "You don't want to settle for some prostitute right away, do you? Before we've even tried for something better?" In the end, they reached a compromise. They would try the left bank first. There was plenty of time, and then the other. "Wow," Mueller said in the metro station. He had always been good at figuring things out. "See how this works? You push the button where you are, and the one where you want to go, and the whole fucking route lights up. You'd have to be an idiot to get lost in this town." Yeah. And Colby soon had to admit that Mueller was right about the left bank. Even after a couple of hours, its endless streets and boulevards failed to suggest that anything nice might happen. You could see hundreds of people sitting, bright with talk and laughter, in each of the long, deep sidewalk cafes, with plenty of good-looking girls among them. But their cool and quickly averted glances established at once their membership in the majority of French who detested Americans. And if you did occasionally see a pretty girl walking alone and tried to catch her eye, however bashfully, she looked capable of pulling a police whistle out of her purse and blowing it hard on being asked if she was in business. But, oh Jesus God, the area up around the Place Pigalle, it throbbed in the new fallen darkness with the very pulse of sex. It had a decidedly sinister quality, too, in the shadows and in the guarded faces of everyone you saw. Steam rose from iron manhole lids in the street, and it was instantly turned red and blue and green, the vivid lights of gas and electric signs. Girls and women were everywhere, walking and waiting among hundreds of prowling soldiers. Colby and Mueller took their time, watching everything, seated at a cafe table and nursing highballs of what the waiter had promised was American whiskey. Dinner was out of the way. They had made a quick stop at the Red Cross to wash up and to eat, and Mueller had left his camera there. He didn't want to look like some tourist tonight, so there was nothing to do for a while but watch. "See the girl coming out of the door with the guy across the street?" Mueller inquired, narrowing his eyes. "See him? The girl in the blue, and the guy's walking away from her now?" "Yeah." "I swear to God, it wasn't 5 minutes ago I saw them going in that door. Son of a bitch. She gave him 5 minutes, less than 5 minutes, and she probably charged him $20. Jesus." And Colby took a drink to help him sort out a quick profusion of ugly pictures in his mind. What could be accomplished in 5 minutes? Wouldn't it take almost that long just to get undressed and dressed again? How miserably premature could a premature ejaculation be? Maybe she'd blown him, but even that, according to exhaustive discourse in the tent, was supposed to take a hell of a lot longer than 5 minutes. Or maybe this was the possibility that brought a chill around his heart. Maybe the man had been stricken with panic up there in the room. Maybe, watching her get ready, he had suddenly known he couldn't do what was expected, known it beyond all hope of trying or even pretending to try, and so had blurted some apology in high school French and shoved money into her hands, and she'd followed him closely downstairs, talking all the way. Coarse, contemptuous, cruel, until they were free to separate in the street. For himself, Colby decided it would be best not to go with a streetwalker, even one he might spend a long time choosing for qualities of youth and health and the look of a gentle nature. The thing to do was find a girl in a bar, this bar or one of the others, and talk with her for a while, however brokenly, and go through the pleasant ritual of buying drinks. Because even if the girls in the bars were only streetwalkers at rest, or could they be whores of a higher caliber with higher prices? And how could you possibly find out about distinctions like that? Even so, you might at least have some sense of acquaintance before arriving at the bed. It took Colby a minute or two to catch the waiter's eye for another round, and when he turned back, he found George Mueller conversing with a woman who sat alone at the next table, a few inches away. The woman, you couldn't call her a girl, was trim and pleasant-looking, and from the stray phrases Colby overheard, she seemed to be speaking mostly in English. Mueller had turned his chair away for talking, so his face was partly obscured, but Colby could see the heavy blush of it and the tense, shy smile. Then he saw the woman's hand moving slowly up and down Mueller's thigh. "Paul," Mueller said when he and the woman got up to leave, "look, I may not see you again tonight, but I'll see you, in the morning, okay? The Red Cross. Or maybe not in the morning, but, we'll work it out." "Sure, that's okay." In no other bar of the entire area around the Place Pigalle could a girl or a woman be found sitting alone. Paul Colby made certain of that because he tried them all, tried several of them twice or 3 times, and he drank so much in the course of his search that he wandered miles from where he'd started. He was in some wholly separate part of Paris when the sound of a rollicking piano brought him in off the street to a strange little American-style bar. There he joined 5 or 6 other soldiers, most of them apparently strangers to one another. They stood with their arms around each other's Eisenhower jackets and sang all 10 choruses of Roll Me Over at the top of their lungs, with the piano thumping out the melody in the flourishes. Somewhere in the 6th or 7th verse it struck Colby that this might be considered a fairly memorable way to conclude your first night in Paris. But by the time it ended he knew better, and so plainly did all the other singers. George Mueller had said you would have to be an idiot to get lost in this town. But Paul Colby stood for half an hour in some metro station pushing buttons, making more and more elaborate route patterns light up in many colors, until a very old man came along and told him how to get to the Red Cross Club. And there, where everybody knew that only some kind of twerp would want to spend much time, he crawled into his dormitory bed as if it were the last bed in the world. Things were even worse the next day. He was too sick with a hangover to get his clothes on until noon. Then he crept downstairs and looked into each of the public rooms for George Mueller, knowing he wouldn't find him. And he walked the streets for hours, on sore feet, indulging himself in the bleak satisfactions of petulance. What the hell was supposed to be so great and beautiful about Paris anyway? Had anybody ever had the guts to say it was just another city like Detroit or Chicago or New York, with too many pale, grim men in business suits hurrying down the sidewalks and with too much noise and gasoline exhaust and too much plain damned uncivilized rudeness? Had anybody yet confessed to being dismayed and bewildered and bored by this whole fucking place, and lonely as a bastard too? Late in the day he discovered white wine. It salved and dispelled his hangover. It softened the rasp of his anger into an almost pleasant melancholy. It was very nice and dry and mild, and he drank a great deal of it, slowly, in one quietly obliging cafe after another. He found various ways to compose himself at the different tables, and soon began to wonder how he must look to casual observers. That for as long as he could remember, he had been one of his most secret, most besetting, least admirable habits of mind. He imagined, as the white wine wore on and on, that he probably looked like a sensitive young man in wry contemplation of youth and love and death, an interesting young man, and on that high wave of self-regard he floated home and hit the sack again. The final day was one of stunted thought and shriveled hope, of depression so thick that all of Paris lay awash and sinking in it while his time ran out. Back in the Place Pigalle at midnight and drunk again, or more likely feigning drunkenness to himself, he found he was almost broke. He couldn't afford even the most raucous of middle-aged tours now, and he knew he had probably arranged in his secret heart for this to be so. There was nothing left to do but make his way to the dark part of the city where the army trucks were parked. You weren't really expected to make the first truck. You could even miss the last truck and nobody would care very much. But those unspoken rules of conduct no longer applied to Paul Colby. He was very likely the only soldier in Europe ever to have spent 3 days in Paris without getting laid. And he had learned beyond a question now that he could no longer attribute his trouble to shyness or awkwardness. It was fear. It was worse than fear. It was cowardice. "How come you didn't pick up my messages?" George Mueller asked him in the tent the next day. Mueller had left 3 notes for Colby on the Red Cross message board. He said, one on the morning after they'd split up that first night and 2 others later. "I guess I didn't even notice there was a message board." "Well, Christ, it was right there in the front room by the desk," Mueller said, looking hurt. "I don't see how you could have missed it." And Colby explained, despising himself and turning away quickly afterwards, that he hadn't really spent all that much time in the Red Cross Club. Less than a week later, he was summoned by the orderly room and told that the papers for his compassionate leave were ready. And a few days after that, abruptly deposited somewhere in London, he checked into a murmurous, echoing Red Cross Club that was almost a duplicate of the one in Paris. He spent a long time in the shower and changed meticulously into his other wholly clean uniform, stalling and stalling. Then, with his finger trembling in the dial of the cumbersome British coin telephone, he called his mother. "Oh, my dear," their voice said, "is this really you? How very strange." It was arranged that he would visit her that afternoon, for tea, and he rode out to her suburb on a clattering commuter's train. "Oh, well, how nice," she said in the doorway of her tidy, semi-detached house. "And how fine you are in your marvelous American uniform. Oh, my dear, oh, my dear." As she pressed the side of her head against the ribbons and the combat badge, she seemed to be weeping, but he couldn't be sure. He said it certainly was good to see her, too, and they walked together into a small living room. "Well, my goodness," she said, having apparently dried her tears, "how can I possibly hope to entertain a great big American soldier in a scruffy little house like this?" But soon they were comfortable, at least as comfortable as they would ever be, sitting across from each other in upholstered chairs while the clay filaments popped and hissed and turned blue and orange in the small gas fireplace. She told him her husband would soon be home, as would their son, who was now 6 and dying to meet him. "Well, good," he said. "And I did try to reach Marcia on the phone, but I was a fraction of a second too late at the embassy switchboard. Then later I rang her flat, but there was no answer, so I expect they're both out. She's been sharing a flat with another girl for a year or so now, you see." And here his mother sniffed sharply through one nostril and turned her face partly away, a mannerism that brought her suddenly alive from his memory. "She's quite the young woman of the world these days. Still, we can try again later in the evening, and perhaps we'll—" "No, that's okay," he said. "I'll call her tomorrow." "Well, whatever you wish." And it was whatever he wished for the rest of the rapidly darkening afternoon. Even after her husband had come home, a drained-looking man in middle age, whose hat left a neat ridge around the crown of his flat, well-combed hair, and who ventured almost no conversational openings, and their little boy, who seemed far from dying to meet him as he peered from hiding and stuck out his tongue. Would Paul like another bread-and-butter sandwich with his tea? Good. Would he like a drink? Oh, good. And was he sure he wouldn't stay a while longer and have some sort of scrappy little supper with them? Baked beans on toast sort of thing? And spend the night? Because really, there was plenty of room. It was whatever he wished. Hardly wait to get out of the house, though he kept assuring himself on the train back into town that he hadn't been rude. And he awoke barely able to face breakfast in his nervousness about calling the American embassy. "Who?" said a switchboard operator. "What department is that, please?" "Well, I don't know. I just know she works there. Isn't there some way you can—" "Just a moment. Yes, here. We do have a Miss Colby Marcia in disbursements. I'll connect you." And after several buzzings and clickings, after a long wait, a voice came on the line as clear as a flute, and happy to hear from him, a sweet-sounding English girl. "Well, that'd be marvelous," she was saying. Could you come around 5? It's the first building over from the main one, just to the left of the FDR statue, if you're coming up from Berkeley Square. You can't miss it. And I'll be there in half a minute if you're waiting, or, I'll be waiting there if you're late." It took him a while to realize, after hanging up the phone, that she hadn't spoken his name. She had probably been shy, too. There was an overheated shop in the Red Cross basement where 2 sweating, jabbering cockneys in undershirts would steam press your whole uniform for half a crown, while many soldiers waited in line for the service, and Colby chose to kill part of the afternoon down there. He knew his clothes didn't really need pressing, but he wanted to look nice tonight. And he was coming up from Berkeley Square, trying in every stride to perfect where he hoped would be a devil-may-care kind of walk. There was the FDR statue, and there was her office building. And there in the corridor, straggling alone behind a group of other women and girls, came a hesitant, large-eyed, half-smiling girl who could only have been Marcia. "Paul?" she inquired. "Is it Paul?" He rushed forward and enwrapped her in a great hug, pinning her arms and nuzzling her hair, hoping to swing her laughing off her feet. And he brought it off well, probably from his self-tutelage in the devil-may-care walk. By the time her shoes hit the floor again, she was laughing, with every sign of having liked it. "Well," she said, "aren't you something?" "So are you," he said, and offered her his arm for walking. In the first place they went to, which he described as a rather nice smallish pub not far from here, he kept secretly congratulating himself on how well he was doing. His talk was fluent. Once or twice he even made her laugh again, and his listening was attentive and sympathetic. Only one small thing went wrong. He had assumed that English girls liked beer, but she changed her order to pink gin, which made him feel dumb for having failed to ask her, apart from that he couldn't find anything the matter with his performance. If there had been a mirror behind the bar, he would have certainly sneaked a happy glance into it on his way to the men's room. He had stamped twice on the old floor in the regulation manner for making his trouser legs blouse down over his boots, then walked away from her through the smoke-hung crowd in the new devil-may-care style, and he hoped she was watching. "What does disbursements mean?" he asked when he got back to their table. "Oh, nothing much. In a business firm, I suppose you'd call it the payroll office. I'm a payroll clerk." "Ah, I know." And she said then, with a smile that turned wittily sour, "Mother's told you I'm with the American Embassy." God. I heard her saying that to people on the phone a few times when I was still living there. That was about the time I decided to move out. He had been so concerned with himself that he didn't realize until now, offering a light for her cigarette, what a pretty girl she was. And it wasn't only in the face, she was nice all the way down. "I'm afraid our timing's been rather awkward, Paul," she was saying, "because tomorrow's the last day before my vacation night, and I had no idea you were coming, you see, so I arranged to spend the week with a friend up in Blackpool. But we can get together again tomorrow night, if you like. Could you come up to the flat for supper or something?" "Sure, that'd be fine." "Oh, good. Do come. It won't be much, but we can sort of fortify ourselves by having a real dinner tonight." Jesus, I'm hungry. Aren't you? And he guessed that a lot of English girls had learned to say Jesus during the war. She took him to what she called a good black market restaurant, a warm, closed-in upstairs room that did look fairly clandestine. They sat surrounded by American officers and their women, forking down rich slices of what she told him was horse meat steak. They were oddly shy with each other there, like children in a strange house. But soon afterwards, in the next pub they visited, they got around to memories. "It's funny," she said. "I missed Daddy terribly at first. It was like a sickness. But then it got so I couldn't really remember him very well. And lately, I don't know, his letters seem so, well, sort of loud and empty, sort of vapid. Yeah, well, he's a very, yeah." And once during the war, he sent me a public health service pamphlet about venereal disease. That wasn't really a very tactful thing to do, was it? No, no, it wasn't. But she remembered the electric train and the paper dolls. She remembered the terrifying jump from the maple tree. The worst part, she said, was that you had to clear another horrible big branch on the way down, and yes, she remembered waiting alone in the car that afternoon while their parents shouted in the house. She even remembered that Paul had come out to the car to say goodbye. At the end of the evening, they settled into still another place, and that was where she started talking about her plans. She might go back to the States and go to college next year. That was what their father wanted her to do, but then there was also a chance that she might go back and get married. Yeah, no kidding. Who to? The little smile she gave him then was the first disingenuous look he had seen in her face. "I haven't decided," she said, "because you see, there have been a number of offers. Well, almost any number." And out of her purse came a big, cheap American wallet of the kind with many hinged plastic frames for photographs. There was one smiling or frowning face after another, most of them wearing their overseas caps, a gallery of American soldiers. "And this is Chet," she was saying. "He's nice. He's back in Cleveland now. And this is John. He'll be going home soon to a small town in East Texas. And this is Tom. He's nice. There were probably 5 or 6 photographs, but there seemed to be more. One was a decorated 82nd Airborne man who was impressive, but another was a member of service and support personnel, a Blue Star Commando. And Colby had learned to express a veiled disdain for those people. "Well, but what does that matter?" she inquired. "I don't care what he did or didn't do in the war. What's that got to do with anything?" "Okay, I guess you're right," he said while she was putting the wallet away, and he watched her closely. "But look, are you in love with any of these guys?" Oh, well, certainly I suppose so, she said, but then that's easy, isn't it? What is? Being in love with someone, if he's nice and you like him. And that gave him much to think about all the next day. The following night, when he'd been asked to come up for supper or something, he gravely inspected her white, ill furnished apartment and met her roommate, whose name was Irene. She looked to be in her middle 30s, and it was clear from her every glance and smile that she enjoyed sharing a place with someone so much younger. She made Colby uneasy at once by telling him what a nice looking boy he was. Then she hovered and fussed over Marcia's fixing the drinks, which were a cheap brand of American blended whiskey and soda with no ice. The supper turned out to be even more perfunctory than he'd imagined: a casserole of spam and sliced potatoes and powdered milk. And while they were still at a table, Irene laughed heartily at something Colby said, something he hadn't meant to be all that funny. Recovering, her eyes shining, she turned to Marcia and said, "Oh, he's sweet, your brother, isn't he? And do you know something? I think you're right about him. I think he is a virgin." There are various ways of enduring acute embarrassment. Colby might have hung his blushing head, or he might have struck a cigarette in his lips and lighted it, squinting, looking up at the woman with still narrowed eyes and saying, "What makes you think that?" But what he did instead was burst out laughing. And he went on laughing and laughing long after the time for showing what a preposterous assumption they had made. He was helpless in his chair. He couldn't stop. "Irene," Marcia was saying, and she was blushing too. "I don't know what you're talking about. I never said that." "Oh, well, sorry, my fault," Irene said, but there was still a sparkle in her eye across the messy table when he pulled himself together at last, feeling a little sick. Marcia's train would leave at 9 from some station far in the north of London, so she had to hurry. "Look, Paul," she said over the hasty packing of her suitcase, "there's really no need for you to come along all that way. I'll just run up there by myself." But he insisted. He wanted to get away from Irene, and so they rode nervously together without speaking on the underground. But they got off at the wrong stop. "Jesus, that was foolish," she said. "Now we'll have to walk." And when they were walking, they began to talk again. "I'll never know what possessed Irene to say such a silly thing," she said. "That's okay. Forget it." "Because I only said you seemed very young. Was that such a terrible thing to say?" "I guess not. I mean, whoever minded being young, for God's sake? Isn't that what everyone wants to be?" "I guess so." "Oh, you guess not, and you guess so. Well, it's true. Everyone does want to be young. I'm 18 now, and sometimes I wish I were 16 again." "Why?" "Oh, so I could do things a little more intelligently, I suppose. Try not to go chasing after uniforms quite so much. British or Americans, I don't know." So she had been laid at 16, either by some plucky little RAF pilot or some slavering American, and probably by several of both. He was tired of walking and of carrying the suitcase. It took an effort of will to remind himself that he was an infantry soldier. Then she said, "Oh, look, we've made it." And they ran the last 50 yards into the railroad station and across its echoing marble floor. But her train had gone, and there wasn't another one due to leave for an hour. They sat uncomfortably on an old bench for a while, then they went out to the street again to get fresh air. She took the suitcase from him, placed it against the base of the lamppost, and seated herself prettily on it, crossing her nice legs. Her knees were nice, too. She looked thoroughly composed. She would leave tonight knowing he was a virgin. She would know it forever, whether she ever saw him again or not. "Paul," she said. "Yeah?" "Look, I was only sort of teasing you about those boys in photographs. I don't know why I did that, except to be silly." "Okay, I knew you were teasing, but it was a relief to hear her say it even so. They were just boys I met when I used to go to the Red Cross dances at Rainbow Corner. None of them ever really did propose to me except Chet, and that was only a kidding around sort of thing because he said I was pretty. If I ever took him up on it, he'd die." "Okay. And it was silly just now to tell you about chasing uniforms when I was 16. God, I was terrified of boys at 16. Have you any idea what it is that makes people of our age want to claim more knowledge of sex and so forth than they really have?" No, no, I don't. He was beginning to like her more and more, but he was afraid that if he let her go on, she would soon insist she was a virgin too, to make him feel better. That would almost certainly be a condescending lie, and so would only make him feel worse. Because, I mean, we have our whole lives, she said. Isn't that right? Take you. You'll be going home soon and going to college. And there'll be girls coming in and out of your life for years. Then eventually you'll fall in love with someone, and isn't that what makes the world go round? She was being kind to him. He didn't know whether to be grateful or to sink even further into wretchedness. And then me. Well, I'm in love with someone now, she said. And this time there appeared to be no teasing in this. I wanted to tell you about him ever since we met, but there hasn't been time. He's the man I'm going up to spend the week with in Blackpool. His name is Ralph Kovacs, and he's 23. He was a waist gunner on a B-17, but he only flew 13 missions because his nerves fell apart, and he's been in and out of hospitals ever since. He's sort of small and funny looking, and all he wants to do is sit around in his underwear reading great books. And he's going to be a philosopher, and I've sort of come to think I can't live without him. I may not go to his states. I may not go to the States at all next year. I may go to Heidelberg because that's where Ralph wants to go. The whole question is whether or not he'll let me stay with him. Oh, Colby said, I see. What do you mean, you see? You really aren't much of a conversationalist, you know that. You see. What can you possibly see from what little I've told you? Jesus. How can you see anything at all with those big, round, virginal eyes of yours? He was walking away from her, head down, because there seemed to be nothing else to do. But he hadn't gone far before she came running after him, her little high-heeled shoes clicking on the sidewalk. Oh, Paul, don't go away, she called. Come back. Please, please come back. I'm terribly sorry. So they went back together to where the suitcase stood against the lamppost, but this time she didn't sit down. I'm terribly sorry, she said again, and look, don't come to the train with me. I want to say goodbye here. Only listen, listen. I know you'll be all right. We'll both be all right. It's awfully important to believe that. Well, God bless. Okay, and you too, he said. You too, Marcia. Then her arms went up and around his neck, and the whole slender weight of her was pressed against him for a moment, and in a voice broken with tears she said, Oh, my brother. He walked a great distance alone after that, and there wasn't anything devil may care about it. The heels of his boots came down at a calm, regular cadence, and his face was set in the look of a practical young man with a few things on his mind. Tomorrow he would telephone his mother and say he'd been called back to France for duty, a phrase she would neither understand nor ever question. Then all that would be finished. And with 7 days left in this vast, intricate English-speaking place, there was every reason to expect he would have a girl.